Well, welcome to all who are entering into this great event today. So I'll make sure nobody else is showing up. I think everybody's there. So let's go ahead and get going. We've got such a great presentation. I want to have absolutely as much time as possible for Rebekah's comments. So I'm Greg Kutsona. I am part of the board of the Oxford Interfaith Forum. I'm also a lecturer in religious studies and humanities at California State University, Chico. So Chico, because most people don't know where it is in Northern California, way up above Sacramento. So that's where I am right now. I'm also a co-director of Science for the Church, which is a group that brings together science and theology, and that's my particular area of interest. So at some point, you'll hear more from me, so I will stop talking about myself, but I just want to introduce who I was. Let me talk about Rebekah, because this is what's so interesting and related to our event today. So Rebekah Wallace is completing her DPhil in Science and Religion under the supervision of Professor Alistair McGrath. She works in the field of science and religion at the intersection of cognitive science and theology. And she explores embodied cognition as a tool for understanding Christian theological anthropology and exploring human personhood and identity in a non-Cartesian paradigm. So I was really interested to read that she also draws upon some older thinkers, some venerable thinkers like Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. And from the description, I thought this was fascinating. Her work attempts to explore the ways in which current substance dualist views of the mind and body might anachronistically utilize concept from ancient sources to support a quite recent development in philosophical and theological thought in the last few hundred years. Her initial findings suggest that a more holistic, Thomistic, hylomorphic approach could solve some of the philosophic problems posed by these presentations. So that particularly fascinated me. In addition, let me just say about Rebekah that she will be starting a position at SCIO in grants and research, and the title is yet to be determined, but that's exciting. And congratulations on that new job and on your work. And with that, let me say one more thing, sorry, as a logistic. What I'd love to do is have you put questions in the chat, and then I can kind of organize them a little bit more easily. So the initial questions, I think, will come from what you put in the chat. And then as time permits, we will just have more of an open discussion, and you can ask questions, just verbally through Zoom when we get there. So once again, if you have questions, and even as we go along, they can be helpful just to throw into the chat, and I will take those in, and then I will moderate the questions for Rebekah after the end of her presentation. So again, with that said, let's hear from you, Rebekah. Thank you so much for presenting today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction. So today I'm going to kind of talk about a broad field that I study, and I'm going to try to position that within a set of discussions which has been happening specifically in theology, but also throughout the humanities in the last decade. And that's the study of this nebulous thing called embodiment. And this has been quite critical in religious studies and theology in the past decade. Donovan Schafer, for example, in his 2015 book, Religious Affects, argued for animal religion, and indeed the animal origins of all religion through affective, which are kind of sub-emotional forces in the body. So I won't go too much into what affect is, but some use it synonymously with emotion, others use it as a kind of fundamental push and pull, a drive, but it's essentially an embodied force that is connected with desire and with motivation. And this has really been making its way into theology. Simeon Zoll out of Cambridge, for example, has recently published a book in 2020, actually, The Holy Spirit in Christian Experience. And he uses affect theory to explain how the Holy Spirit might move and transform our lives at the level of subjective experience and the body. And this kind of calls into question this whole set of connections between desire, embodiment, subjectivity, experience, and belief, and the relationship between emotion, affect, and things like reason or belief. But my talk is actually not about another form of embodiment. What I would like to do is to zoom out and to kind of talk about the conceptual framework for which which I believe has driven discussions of embodiment to date and what gets defined as the body. So I'm going to do this by using a paradigm within the cognitive sciences, which is called embodied cognition. And it's going to be a broad sketch of a new direction of thought that I'm exploring right now with my DPhil. And I'll only have kind of time to orient us in this direction, but I look forward to hearing comments of the discussion afterwards and thoughts. I'm going to do this under 5 headings. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to give you these 5 kind of mental peg holds so that you know where I'm going. The first is that I'm going to highlight how current studies in embodiment do in fact show that there's a clear distinction, that there's not a clear distinction between the mind and body. And in this talk, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to use mind and soul synonymously. You can jump on me afterwards about this, but there are a whole host of complex historical reasons for why this is the case. And often in kind of discussions of philosophy of mind, they are used synonymously. And again, that may be inaccurate, but it is kind of the current trend in the debate. And so I'm going to append myself to that debate in this way. So when I say mind, I also kind of mean soul, and we can talk about Aristotle and that as well later. And I think that the concern for this for many Christians that this could have potentially negative implications for eschatology. And for example, a lot of religious traditions kind of have doctrines surrounding afterlife. Would this be possible if there's no such thing as a separate immortal soul? If we're not kind of Cartesian minds / souls, if we are just our bodies, then what would that mean for immortality, for example? And this isn't really solved even if you have something like the resurrection of the body, which the Christian tradition obviously does, because in the Christian tradition, there's still this notion that after we die, but before the body is resurrected, that we either go to purgatory or we go to hell or we spend time with God or whatever happens in that intermediate state. There doesn't seem to be a suspension of the human person. There seems to be a real entity there that can be judged between death and bodily resurrection. And even if this weren't the case, there are problems. There's a philosophical problem, the continuity of identity. So if we are our bodies and we die and we don't exist between death and resurrection, there's still a problem of how we would be the same person once we were reunited with our bodies. You know, would God have to reconstitute every atom, for example? Would we be exactly the same person? Obviously, our bodies are going to disintegrate. And then, of course, there's the problem of the resurrected body might not even be a physical body. So obviously, 1 Corinthians 15, St. Paul talks about the reality of resurrection. And he says, and I'm going to quote from 1 Corinthians 15 right now, so it will be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. And then he goes on to say, it is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, a life-giving spirit. The spiritual did not come first, but the natural, and after that, the spiritual. So, you know, at the resurrection of the body, what does a body even look like, and what is a spiritual body? It might not be a physical body. And then the last 3 points are I'm going to show how the kind of current philosophical frameworks are restricted right now because they have to talk in these dichotomisms of monism and dualism. But I hope to propose something that might save the day, which is embodied cognition. And I think that this doesn't fall prey to some of the pitfalls of other studies in embodiment, like affect theory. In fact, I think it supports a different philosophical ontology, which is that of hylomorphic dualism. And so that's kind of the progression of this talk. And so I'll jump right into the first point then. I think one of the issues currently with studies in affect and embodiment in general is that they kind of conglomerate lots of things together and slap this with the label of embodiment. So you have affect, emotion, experience, subjectivity, and they're all kind of these seemingly non-quantifiable aspects of our existence. Something, and then kind of we say that thing happens in the body. And then this is kind of seen as a novel discovery that we've discovered that all of a sudden this needs to be accounted for in our higher order systems of rational conscious belief. And so we've kind of been scrambling to explain the way in which the body is connected to these higher order rationales. In other words, I think this reveals a kind of presumption that subjectivity is a problem. And subjectivity is everything that's non-quantifiable. And then the body is blamed for this unquantifiable qualia of the world. And that's how a lot of contemporary discourse is happening. And this is especially relevant to science because part of what is under discussion is, of course, the type of explanation that is accepted as a viable explanation. And this is even for theological concepts such as the soul. So this talk of embodiment is happening within this kind of theology at a twofold level. That is, there's been this effort to try to show how we can account for the importance of the body in our theological anthropology. But there's also been an effort to account for the body in the process of theological reasoning and belief itself, and how those beliefs come about. Most notably here in this case are beliefs about ourselves as human beings, but obviously it's a belief about God. And then if you believe that human beings exist kind of ontologically in relation to God, that can't be separated. And this has been, I think, largely driven by studies in affective and cognitive neuroscience, which I do think kind of show our higher order cognitive, intellectual, rational faculties to be inextricably influenced and in some sense directed by emotional, bodily, affective orientations and responses to the world. And importantly, I think this happens at a level below the level of conscious awareness. It's a sort of orientation of thought. And I'll give just a couple of concrete examples of studies that were done in this. Antonio Damasio is the big neuroscientist who's been working on this and kind of trying to break down this dichotomy between reason and emotion. And there was a very interesting experiment he did with a deck of cards. And there was one deck of cards that was a good deck and one deck of cards that was a bad deck. The patients did not know which deck was good, which was bad. But the patients somehow with normal brain function were able to adjust. So the bad decks had some kind of punitive measure attached and the good decks had some kind of reward. I don't know if it was a small financial reward or whatever. But the players who had normal brain function were able to slowly adjust without consciously developing the strategy. And they couldn't articulate why, but in the end, by the end of the experiment, they had kind of started choosing less of the bad decks and more of the good decks. And they didn't know why they were doing this. They weren't really even aware that they were doing this. But most importantly, their galvanic skin conductance response would change right before they would pick the bad deck. And so there seemed to be this bodily awareness that, whoops, I shouldn't really be doing that. And that would kind of orient them towards the good decks. But the interesting thing Damasio says, and here I quote from his study, we know from the situation of patients who lose the covert biasing system, patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex or to the amygdala, that the decision apparatus is impoverished to a dramatic degree. And so this is kind of meant to show that conscious decisions are guided by pre-conscious bodily responses that orient action and thought. And there was another really interesting experiment that Damasio and his wife did with patients with prosopagnosia, which is face blindness. And so if you are face blind, you can't recognize faces, no matter if it's loved ones who you've known for years, parents, lovers, friends. But what would happen is that these patients couldn't identify when they were shown a series of pictures, the difference between strangers and loved ones. But again, when their galvanic skin response was measured, there was a reaction before or right after they were shown the pictures of loved ones, and it corresponded to the level of intimacy. So there's this sense in which the body is sensing, even though not only could they not articulate what was happening, but they didn't know, there's a knowledge that is in the body itself. And this is there's been a lot of stir around the vagus polyvagal theory right now in the vagus nerve. And there's this idea that, the vagus nerve is part of the parasympathetic nervous system. And there seems to be evidence that actually if our body senses through something called neuroception that we're in danger, either social danger or physical danger, then it might shut down in certain ways and actually prevent access to certain brain structures. So this idea that we kind of are these conscious, rational beings that then just make decisions about the world, kind of being undermined by a lot of these studies that show that our body holds knowledge and senses the environment first before it even gets to the level of conscious awareness. But I would argue, I kind of look at this and wonder whether it's through affect theory, whether it's through neuroscience, which shows the body and mind to be more intimately and causally linked than we've kind of thought in the past, if there's not some kind of tacit ontology in all of this, which should be interrogated. Because what embodied cognition actually says, and I'll elaborate on this in a bit, is that thought is not influenced by emotion, but rather there's no such thing as thought that is separate enough from emotion to have a causal effect. And what I would argue furthermore is that this implies an ontology which reduces the body, not embodied cognition, this kind of emotion reason divide, mind, body divide, implies an ontology which reduces the body just to kind of this causal world of matter, and then tries to give an account for the body in terms of matter explicable just through kind of the laws of physics. And so while we try to explore if there's a separate mind, separate body, and account for how they can affect each other, we assume that the body is kind of separate and is just this physical extension. And this is kind of Descartes' problem, is how if you have a separate mind and you have a body, how can they causally interact? And I've seen this kind of quite a bit in my studies of philosophy of mind, that a lot of philosophers, they say, well, monism can't be true because of this, and therefore dualism, or dualism can't be true because of this, and therefore monism. And there seems to be this real dichotomy between the two, and nothing really that skirts in the middle. You either have monism or you have dualism. You have a reductive physicalism or you have a Cartesian substance dualism. And so I'm going to quickly go through kind of what the main tenets of dualism are as I see them, and as the kind of contemporary discussions have gone. And I think, you know, the main thing about dualism is that, supposedly originating from Descartes, you know, when you have this problem of you have two substances, one is physical, one is non-physical, how can they relate? How can they have causal effects on each other? This is actually something that in his correspondence with Elizabeth of Bohemia, Elizabeth brought up, and Descartes didn't really address it. He kind of said, well, I don't think that's a super big problem because it might not be the same kinds of causes as the physical world. You know, if there's a non-physical reality, how do we account for that? But he doesn't really address it in any rigor, although some of his critics immediately after publication did. And so I think the point that I want to highlight is that even though the recent focus has flipped from how the mind might affect the body to studies showing how the body might influence the mind, there's still this idea that mind and body are separate. And this means we need to somehow account for their relationship to each other. And then often, as I said, when this problem can't be solved in dualism, there's a sweep to the other end of the spectrum by prioritizing the reality of only one of these substances. So if you're a reductive physicalist, it's the body that gets priority in reality. And here I mean kind of the colloquial term, the body, because part of what I'm trying to do is kind of rethink what we mean by the body, but just physical extension on Descartes' model. And then you have the soul consciousness mind. In short, anything which is not physical becomes, as Mary Midgley puts it, just more froth on top. And if you're an idealist, then you prioritize the reality of the mind, and the physical world becomes incidental. And Patrick Brecker, I think, had a really interesting breakdown of this. He called it, he said there was mental monism, and for the mental monist, the physical world is just a mental construct. And then you have physical monism, and in physical monism, you have two branches. You have reductive physicalism, which is just kind of the mental is the physical, or non-reductive, in which the mental is an emergent property of the physical that can have top-down effects. But I think what's important to note is that none of these three options, either substance dualism, reductive physicalism, or non-reductive physicalism, kind of breaks the essential dichotomy between physical and non-physical, because basically it's still working on the presumption that you either have a physical or non-physical, and you can have both if you're a dualist. If you're a monist, you can have one, you can take your pick, whatever, you know, which one. And so if these are indeed our only options, I think that physicalism probably is the most viable, because studies in the cognitive sciences and cognitive neuroscience are pointing fairly conclusively to the fact, I think, that the mind does not exist as an independent substance. There's no kind of central thing that can be found that we can point to and say this is the mind. And indeed, studies in embodied cognition show that there's very possibly no central processing unit at all when it comes to mental activity. There's not even kind of a physical location like the brain in which this takes place. And this goes against kind of traditional cognitive models of the 1950s that saw the mind as an input-output machine. But rather in embodied cognition, mental activities are seen as a kind of emergent property of the body in its interaction with the environment. So we don't create representations of the world in our heads. We use, as Francisco Varela says, the world as its own model. So I'll give a couple concrete examples because it's very abstract right now. It used to be thought, according to traditional kind of cognitivist approaches, that if a baseball player was trying to catch a ball, he was running to catch the ball, and is somehow in the background, all these calculations about arc and speed and velocity and like wind resistance were going on in his head, and then he would, you know, somehow catch the ball if he was good, you know, if his mind was good at that, somehow running in the background. But actually, one of the things that embodied cognition would posit is maybe he's just simply keeping the ball straight in his line of sight, so that he's using the physical environment as a way of offloading cognitive work onto the environment. And another image that I like to think of is the tuna fish. So when scientists first started to study the tuna, they were really baffled by how quickly the tuna could move, because according to kind of the brute facts on paper, given their speed, or excuse me, given their kind of mass and their length and their size, they shouldn't actually have been able to maneuver as quickly as they did. But what it was discovered is that they were creating their own eddies and vortices in the water, as well as riding the currents to gain the speed and agility they need. So this idea that actually the mind is not kind of this thing of brute fact, but we're interacting with the environment to kind of enact these cognitive capacities. And so this has kind of been recreated in a robotics environment. Embodied cognition was kicked to the forefront a little bit when AI wasn't really, AI was kind of at a standstill. And Rodney Brooks, one of the big roboticists, tried to create creatures that had, I mean, not complex, but at least it seemed like directed kind of tasks based off of layered behavioral approaches. So he had a little robot that would go around collecting Coke cans, I think, off of the top of counters. And you would think that there was a program that kind of you would upload and it would say, go collect all the Coke cans, and it was kind of a central place. But actually what happened is he had a lot of different layers of behavior where he said, for example, go explore unexplored territory, stop if you encounter an obstacle, always turn left if this, and there became an emergent, seemingly directed activity out of this that had no central processor. And perhaps the most interesting, because it mirrors kind of the natural activity in the world, is Barbara Webb, who created robo-crickets. So crickets are very bizarre. They have, for their mating season, they have two eardrums, one on each front leg, and the eardrum is connected to a motor neuron in each side. And the female cricket is quite picky, so she only responds to a chirp of a certain number of hertz. I think it's like 54 hertz, I don't know. And she'll always respond to the loudest chirp, and that's how she selects her mate. And so the idea was that perhaps actually this motor neuron was just being activated and it was helping her navigate without her kind of thinking consciously, intentionally saying, I'm going to choose that mate. And Barbara Webb was in fact able to kind of recreate cricket mating behavior with robots that had, just speakers for kind of eardrums, and they were able to navigate just based on these simple layered behavioral patterns. So since this is a whistle-stop tour, I'm just going to sum up embodied cognition in this way as a kind of laborious sentence, but mind is a system of self-constituting processes in which domain-specific actions are layered to give rise to behavioral outcomes without the aid of a central processing unit, yielding a representational or internal model of the world. I think this idea of kind of more radical embodied approaches, that thought is non-representational, is kind of important. It's important on two fronts. One, because it breaks down this mind-world divide that we have. So many of the problems of how we can know the external world, if we're just simply this internal isolated mind, are resolved if cognition arises from the interaction with the world as its own model, rather than having to translate the world into a representation. So it has epistemological significance. And an illustration of this from kind of more radical embodied approaches is Esther Tellin's interpretation of Piaget's A not B error. So if anyone's familiar with this, Piaget's A not B error is for children, I think 8 to 12 months, when children are supposed to develop some kind of concept of object permanence. And so the A not B error is that a child sat down and there's a toy and you hide it in place A, and then the child reaches for the toy, and then you take the toy and you hide it in plain sight, but you hide it in location B, and the child's seen you move the toy, but yet the child will still reach to place A even though they've seen the toy being hidden. And Piaget's interpretation of this was actually that they were developing at that, at age 8 to 12 months, they were developing an idea, a concept of object permanence. And what Esther Tellin said is, well, actually, this couldn't account for variations in results, such as if it's hidden under a blanket versus a box, if it's done at home versus in a laboratory, whatever, if it's a different color, And so she suggested that perhaps this wasn't some kind of abstract concept of object permanence, but simply the child was remembering. There was a bodily memory of reaching towards one and not the other. And so I think, this also has potentially some kind of ontological significance. So this would include, for example, some forms of idealism, which the world is just simply a mental construct, because there's no such thing as a mental life without the physical interaction with the world. And what I'd like to stress is the importance of dynamism in embodied cognition. It's not just the fact that embodied cognition is embodied, it's that bodies are alive, that they move, that they navigate the world. And cognition is part of this dynamic living embodiment. So they did an experiment with kittens, actually, which kittens taken at a stage in which they were developing their sight. One was hooked up to a cart, the other was put in the back of the cart, and then they were exposed to light. And the kitten who was pulling the cart developed completely normal eyesight, and the kitten who was passive in the cart, even though they saw the same things, didn't develop normal eyesight. They in fact acted as if they were blind, because there's something about navigating the world that's important for the development of sight and the perceptual capacity of sight. And this is meant to show how cognition is essentially perceptually guided action. But I think the important thing is that some would say the philosophical implications of embodied cognition either require a commitment to reductive physicalism, or just kind of you have to take dualism and say, well, nothing can explain a dualist model because we don't understand kind of this immaterial universe. But what I'm going to propose is that there's actually a third option to the philosophical problem. And I'm going to illustrate a few ways in which I think embodied cognition supports this third option. And this option is hylomorphism, and sometimes known as hylomorphic dualism. And in a brief kind of rundown of hylomorphism, it's an Aristotelian view with the relationship between form and matter. It was later adopted and adapted by Thomas Aquinas for Christian theology, and it describes the soul as the form of the body. So Aristotle describes it as similar to wax impression. The soul is the form of the wax in the wax impression. They're not two separate substances, but the soul is the organizing principle. And to understand what this means, it's also necessary to understand that for Aristotle, there are four types of causes: the material cause, the efficient cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. The material cause is that out of which something is made. The efficient cause is the source of change. The formal cause is the essence of a thing, the thing that makes it this thing rather than another thing. And the final cause, that for which a thing is its purpose or goal. And in modern science, I think we often reduce the word cause to efficient causes only. In other words, it's just kind of external push or pull principle, it's movement, it's change. But if we look at the causes as types of explanation or layers of explanation, we see how ontology fits in, because as Michael Dodd says, for something to be a cause, it needs to be an element of ontological dependence. And so for Aristotle, anything that exists physically, for it to be said to exist, the four causes operate as a principle of its existence. So there is no such thing as matter without form. There's no just simply body that is extension. But matter without form would be what Aristotle calls prime matter. It exists, prime matter is essentially pure potentiality. It doesn't exist in any real sense. And this means that unlike when we think of matter in the kind of colloquial modern sense, it's not matter as opposed to the non-physical realm somewhere else, but rather there are these levels of explanation that cannot be explained away, embedded within the existence of the physical world. But there's a necessary further step, I think, when we talk about the soul, because the soul is the form of the body, but it's a dynamic form, it's an organizing principle. And the fact that an animal or a human being or any living thing is living is an important distinction. To clarify here, the soul is the substantial form of the body. There's not kind of one form for the body's matter as material and the soul in addition. In other words, we're not, flesh statues with a soul infused. The body is the dynamic organizing principle, unlike with a bronze statue, which is just kind of accidental form. The soul for a living human being is the substantial form. It's what makes it this thing rather than another. And so Eleanor Stump, the well-known Thomist, says it's in virtue of this one form a human being exists as an actual being, as a material object, as a living thing, as an animal, and as a human being with cognitive capacities. And so because of this, we need to look at the whole human organism first and the different faculties and functions which come with it, being the sort of being it is because of its form or soul. And then we can differentiate the faculties out from that, rather than building up in a parts-oriented way and saying, here's the faculty of sight, and here's our rational thought, and here's this. And this is, I think, what affective theory is kind of implying. It says, okay, we have these things called emotion, and then we have reason, and then we have, let's say like problem solving, and then how do they all kind of slot together, rather than looking at the whole first and differentiating out these different functions as part and parcel of that whole functioning organism. So I'm going to conclude with showing just two resonances of how this view might mesh with embodied cognition. First is to highlight the fact that in embodied cognition, as in hylomorphism, emergent properties and processes have an important ontological status. It's in embodied cognition, the organism is a process, and this process is a self-organizing process, not a thing in the same sense as the Cartesian homunculus. And so in embodied cognition, it's the whole system that acts, developing and changing itself as it interacts with the environment through structural coupling. And structural coupling, I won't go into too much detail, but it's part of a particular form of embodied cognition known as autopoietic inactivism. And it basically states that the organism and the environment co-create each other because the organism is precisely that process which is actively and continuously differentiating itself from the environment. It's a kind of, you might call it nowadays, a kind of like a metabolic closure. And this extends the definition of cognition so that any living organism has what Giovanna Colambetti calls affect-cognition. So cognition is essentially a non-apathy towards one's own existence. And because of this non-apathy, an organism emerges as already existing in a world of value. So there's not this fact-value divide, but this is because the goal of the system is to continue to maintain itself. And so there will be things that it moves towards or away from, even organisms that don't have brains or consciousness. And so there's this sense of teleology and we find in biology. And this level of organismic cognition and perception extends down even kind of to amoebas navigating towards and away from, sugar or something harmful. And Colambetti has this beautiful description I love where she says, we come into the world not looking through a clear glass window, but like a stained glass window. So affect, in other words, is kind of a particular orientation that colors our perception of the world from the get-go. Teleology in Aristotelian terms is obviously the final cause, but this is not the teleology in the sense of a conscious goal or external design, an agent kind of directing intentional purposes, but rather, as Mary Midgley puts it, the word teleology does not cover just conscious human processes. Not cover just conscious human purposes, but the whole of function. Aristotle, who first worked out this form of explanation, never thought of it as arising from the purposes of a creative God. He used it simply for the kind of questioning which asks what particular things are for, what they do for the organism that owns them, what is their telos, their end or aim in the context where they belong. As he pointed out, this kind of reasoning is so indispensable in biology, and the aims it seeks are so obvious that no other way of thinking can displace it. It is simply a fact that all organisms constantly strive toward their own survival, their health, their well-being, their general fulfillment, and their reproduction. And indeed, embodied cognition does say that organism and world co-create each other as a domain of distinctions. And there's this idea that J.J. Gibbs, who is an ecological psychologist and kind of the precursor to embodied cognition, he developed this theory of affordances. And basically what he said is there are no such thing as just objects in the world. And this is part of why AI was kind of trying to figure this out with embodied cognition, because when you think in kind of a parts-oriented way, you look at this object and that object and that object, but actually what we see is dependent on who we are as embodied organisms and our goals for the environment. So a branch to a bird is a place to sit, but to a little kid, it's a place to hang a swing. There's no kind of just branch. there's always branch in relation to something. I'm not actually the first to suggest that there might be a connection between Thomistic Aristotelian hylomorphism and embodied cognition. There are a few, there aren't many, but there's a really interesting piece by Bruce Pelosi, who started to point out the connections between, for example, the nature of habits in Aquinas' virtue theory and embodied cognition. Grant Gillette has pointed out that embodied cognition seems to have more in common with Aristotelian views of mind. And my conclusion then is that discussion of the body should look at how the body is more than just matter when matter is understood as physical extension. All matter inherently has form if it exists, because form is one of the ontological conditions of existence. And a living being has not accidental form or shape, but substantial form, which animates it. And so if it can be seen that hylomorphism is a viable philosophical position, and if it's supported by studies in embodied cognition, I think this is very interesting for questions of eschatology, because the Catholic view, as kind of proposed by Eleanor Stump of Thomistic hylomorphism specifically, can account within the hylomorphist paradigm for the continuance of the soul still. And I rely heavily on Eleanor Stump's interpretation of Aquinas, which I think is brilliant, because I think it seems to me the form of hylomorphism most viable for solving potential problems of eschatology. And those three problems, as we've identified, are immortality, problem of identity continuity, as well as the interaction problem. And so the last stump will say, human souls are kind of, she has this phrase, I love it, the amphibians of the metaphysical world. They inhabit both kind of this realm of souls and the physical world. And this is because the nature of the organizing principle, which is the soul. So there's this great example she gives of the cat enhancer binding protein, which regulates gene expression. And I'm going to quote here from her because I'm not a geneticist, but she says, in its active form, the molecule is a dimer with an alpha helix coil. On Aquinas' way of thinking about material objects, the form of the cat enhancer binder protein is the configuration of the dimer, including the alpha helix coil, and the dimer subunits constitute the matter. So apparently this can be broken down into smaller and smaller units, but the general point is that it configures DNA, but it's itself a configuration. And so to quote from Stump again, in the transition from configuring matter to not configuring matter, the human soul doesn't undergo any radical metaphysical transformation or category switching any more than the molecule C/EBP does the cat enhancer binding protein does when it goes from not configuring to configuring DNA. It remains what it always was, something configured with an ability to configure other things. And so for some, this kind of solves the Cartesian problem because on Descartes' model, the soul is just a configured thing. It's not also a configurer. But if you have the configured and the configurer, then that kind of solves the problem of causal interaction, because you can still have this Aristotelian view in which the soul is the substantial form of the body, and that way it can cause kind of its interaction with the environment because it's a dynamic form. But then also, you don't lose the soul when it's disconnected from the body because it's both configured and configure. And so you can have the soul then live on eternally. And of course, in the Thomistic view, the soul has a visness of particularity. And so that solves the problem of kind of continuity of identity, because you don't just become some vanilla kind of, a general soul. You're still who you are as a person. So this is just kind of the general outline of my thought so far. And I think the main takeaway that I want to start to rethink how we talk about the body and not assume that discussions of embodiment need to somehow account for the body only as physical extension. And I hope to open up the discussion to different types of causal relationships, and seeing that the soul is the active organizing principle of the body is its formal cause. And through this, we can begin to see that the body and soul are actually not separate at all, but rather, as sphereness makes a sphere, the living soul actualizes the body and gives it its thisness and its existence as a whole and entire organism, a human being or whatever living type of organism that it is. So Eleanor Stump makes this connection with Aquinas, saying that we can say that the eye sees, but it would be more appropriate to say that the human being sees. And she quotes Aquinas when he says, we can say that the soul understands in the same way that the eye sees, but it would be more appropriate to say that a human being understands by means of the soul. Likewise, when the body, then the living body, is not just kind of the shape of flesh, it's a living acting organ, perception that interacts with the world and co-creates a world of significance by its acting and perceiving. Thank you so much.
Rebekah, thank you for that. That was really, really wonderful and incredibly thought-provoking and stimulating. So I want to encourage people, if you do have any questions you want to put in chat, you're welcome to do that. But if nobody puts them in chat, we'll just do this more in a fluid way, which is just fine. But Rebekah, I'm going to take moderatorial privilege and start a question, if that's all right. Might give it some other people time to frame theirs. And I'm always interested in the state of the question when I hear a topic that is somewhat new to me. So you mentioned that the state of the question in philosophical circles is between dualism and monism, and where that lies. I'm interested in the state of the question in a sense, in a more popular form, and I'm kind of thinking in two directions. One of the first is that I really connected with embodied cognition is through Evan Thompson's book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist, and his critique of the mindfulness mania, I think is the title of the chapter. Like, mindfulness means going inside internally as if the mind could be separated from embodiment. I mean, it's a very simplistic rendering of his really thoughtful work. But that was the first place where I was thinking what he's tapping into is a lot of people do think the mind is this separate thing, this brain in a vat, the matrix idea, right? You can have this brain that thinks it's embodied somewhere. And then the second way that I think about this, and I think I'm giving you two directions with these two options, so see which one might land better with you, is in my experience, we mentioned pastoral care in part of your description. And when I have talked with people in church contexts, and I've said, we are not some kind of Platonic soul floating uneasily in a body, they feel often like I've taken something from them. Like my soul is who I am. I own that, right? That's me. Don't take that away. My body may be deteriorating and it may die, but I have my soul. I have that. So in a way, the context for this work that you're doing, as it lands in the popular world or in like a church context, it seems to me a lot of people still operate in a very strongly dualistic framework. And I guess partly my question is that your reading as well in the environments you're in more popularly, and or how might this contribute to someone's understanding of things like mindfulness and or their personal experience of their conviction that they will be raised at the last day? So a very broad question, but intentionally broad, so you can just take whatever piece you want and see how you want to answer it.
I love that. Thank you. And I think I can try to connect both questions. So the particular form of embodied cognition I rely on, actually, I don't know if we're talking about the same Evan Thompson, but perhaps Francisco Varela was the kind of first proponent of autopoietic enactivism, but he wrote the book with Eleanor Roche and Evan Thompson, which I'm guessing it might have been the same.
I think that's the same. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that they bring up, so actually they talk about Buddhist mindfulness traditions, but they talk about how it's kind of done incorrectly. And there's an interesting parallel with Descartes, because Descartes obviously often gets the blame. And what Varela says is Descartes just stopped too short. Like he was right to say, let me kind of go internally, but wrong to instead think about that thing as a thing rather than experience it as a process. And so I think the point about mindfulness is very true, but it also highlights the fact that we can talk about embodiment all we want, but that doesn't mean we know how to live in an embodied way. So there's a sense in which method and content are very intimately linked, because the point is that if you still are thinking yourself into this place of thinking myself into a body, you're not actually being embodied, you're just thinking about embodiment. And so from a practical perspective, I think it's true. I wonder at some, I get a lot of resistance when I talk about anti-dualist models, a lot of times from Christians, and I grew up Catholic, and a lot of Catholics will just be like, they will act as if that is the position of the church, and it is like taking everything significant away if that's taken away. But actually it's not the case historically. The Catholic Church is in many ways, obviously there are lots of traditions, but the Thomist hylomorphism has been a part of Catholic tradition for a very long time. So I think you're right. And I've been curious about the gut reactions to this. And I think part of it is a very safe place. So if we're able to think ourselves out of the kind of contingency of our immediate environment, in which we often feel powerless, in which we often are powerless, then we can kind of find this safe space in which we don't need to confront that. But we also don't need to listen to what our body is telling us. We can listen to the whatever we've made up in our mind to make us safe about that situation. And so one of the reasons I became interested in pastoral care was because in my own process of going through Gestalt therapy, one of the things that came about was that I just did not know how to live in a body. I wasn't paying attention to what my body was telling me in the environment. And so part of Gestalt therapy is bringing awareness. Whenever you're sharing a story, what are you feeling in your body and where are you feeling it in your body? Because actually I can make up a whole lot of BS about what's happening without listening to myself about what's happening. And that process of becoming aware was a surprisingly long process. And we know as well from people with trauma that dissociation is huge. And so it's really, I think, a form of dissociation as well. And it's scary to think that, we think we are in control of our thought. And so that's a place of control, but we don't always feel in control of our emotion. And one of the aspects of Gestalt therapy I find really interesting is the principle that the more, to some extent, the more you suffer, the more you're capable of joy, but the more of any emotion you feel, the more you're capable of experiencing any emotion. So there's this idea that, I can or can't control how I feel, but actually in trauma recovery, you can start to allow yourself to feel things again. So I think that there's this process, and we like to think that It's okay, I know who I am because that's something that's stable and I've known my whole life and I'm familiar with. But actually, in a process of bodily healing, you start to become familiar with all of the aspects of yourself that you just never were aware of, but they were contained in your body. I think one last point on that is that mindfulness, I think, in terms of, I think part of it is that we like to think of ourselves as having this identity, and identity is very easily conferred on a particular thing. But Varila's point is that there is no such thing as a self, but there is a whole. And so you can't experience this little one thing, but you can, think of the human person as juggling. If you hold on to all the balls really tightly, you're not really going to have the act of juggling, but the human being is an act.
I love that. Wow, there's so much there. Thank you for that. And I will just say that we had a huge fire here in my area, in this area, the campfire that killed 85 people 3 years ago. And so trauma recovery is part of our experience. And part of trauma recovery is actually to go with bodily recovery, somatic recovery as part of this. And so I don't want to get entirely overly practical, but I think that the practical aspect also really interests me. And so I think this, what you're presenting is really powerful for people. I have another question. I don't believe he's in the Zoom room, Mark Pizzato. It goes like this for you, Rebekah. How does Ian McGilchrist's meta-analysis of left and right cortical research relate to connections you're making between embodied affect cognition and soul, which is in quotes, involving the brain's limbic and subcortical networks as well? How is the soul emergent from body affect cognition and yet survives beyond the body's death? Did you grasp that, or should I read it again?
No, I did. Yeah. That's a really good question. So I talked to Ian McGilchrist last month, and I was at a talk that he gave, and I've read quite a bit of his work. Master's Emissary was quite formative when I started my master's, but he said something in his talk, and he said, I'm really glad people are looking at the body more. And he kind of talked about we know more that I think sensors in a dog's nose outnumber a certain amount of, neurons in our, it wasn't neurons in our brain, I can't remember what it was, but then also that we're starting to learn now that the gut might be a second brain. But I think the one thing that I would say to McGilchrist is that his is a kind of, it is a brain-based interpretation of, it's epistemological, how we perceive the world. And what I'm trying to do is make an ontological claim as well, the way that the world is constituted. And so I think if you make the ontological claim that there is no such, so the parts-oriented way that McGilchrist associates with left brain thinking, I would argue that that is not fundamentally reality, but actually the types of reality that we can perceive with right brain thinking are closer to the actual nature of reality. That being said, I think one of the things that I want to move away from is the idea, I like the idea of brain lateralization, but it's still too brain-based for me. It's not bodily based enough. And I think that, McGilchrist talks a lot about body mapping in the right side of the brain, but there still seems to be this idea that the brain is kind of the center where all of this holistic perception takes place. And what I'm trying to say is, no, actually, the entire body functioning together is what makes these things able to emerge. And therefore, there is bodily knowledge that exists, not necessarily without the brain, just like I couldn't exist without a stomach. But I mean, there are organisms that exist without a stomach. They're still living. But I think I'm just reminded of jellyfish, right? Don't they have, they navigate, but they don't have any, they just have one central nervous system. Anyways, I'm not a marine biologist, but that's the answer.
I can't help you on that one. I'm sorry to say, but I wish I could.
But I think, yes, in answer to your question, I like McGilchrist, not a lot, but I think he can only really make epistemological claims with what he's saying. And I'm trying to make an ontological claim. And I also think that in terms of epistemology, you have to be prepared to have a more holistic, room for more holistic perception. That's bodily based.
Yeah. By the way, I think Mark is actually in this Zoom room. So if you want to unmute, you're welcome to add to that question. If not, I'll just say there are no other questions in chat. So, go ahead, Mark. Yes.
I mean, there has to be a leap of faith to some extent. I think, though, that what I would like to say, at least in this piece, and I think my thesis is that embodied cognition seems to resonate with lots of other aspects of Thomistic anthropology. And if that's the case, part and parcel of that anthropology, according to Stump's interpretation, is that we shouldn't just think about things in terms of this is a substance, i.e. a configured thing. This is a substance, i.e. another configured thing, but that there are some things which can span the gap between configured and configurer. And so if the soul is something which configures the body, that still is completely in line with everything that embodied cognition and with what Aristotelian hylomorphism says, but it doesn't preclude that it is itself a configured thing. It's a configured configurer. I don't have to hand the rest of her argument. She argues a lot from theology and Thomas Aquinas. This is what Thomas Aquinas says as a way of, I don't know that you could ever, I don't know that you could, I haven't made that intellectual jump to trying to prove that from a naturalistic perspective. But I think that one of the things that a lot of my research has shown is that I just don't think we can think about the world in terms of only configure things. You know, there's something about the nature of, let's say, matter or the physical world itself that I don't think can just exist on its own, because we miss levels of explanation that have ontological significance. And so Michael Dodds, who's a big Thomist, says, you know, we've kind of reduced the term cause to one type of cause, which is that, you know, it's the push or pull efficient cause. But actually, we've lost 3 other levels of explanation about things that exist in the material world. And so I think, to your point, even if, you know, we can't prove that the soul lives on, I think there's real reason to question the fact that the material world is all that there is, partly because looking at the material world, even now, before it disintegrates, before it's gone, that's not all there is, I don't think. And I don't think you can explain the physical world only on the basis of efficient causes. I hope that answers a little bit more.
So Rebekah, that we have one question that came through chat and one, I see a hand raised. So what if I ask the question in chat, the person who's raised your hand, Jacob Fong, please ask your question after I do. And then anybody else who wants to add in for our last 6 or 7 minutes, please do. The question was from Wesley Brown. What do you think of Julian Jaynes' contribution to this line of conception, this line of thinking? Is there, has that been a source for you, or do you have anything to comment on that?
I haven't encountered, but I'd be interested. If you wanted to summarize and be more specific, I might be able to have a comment, but I'm not familiar enough.
Okay. Wesley, if you're and you want to comment verbally, that's great. I don't have anything to add personally, because it's not somebody I've drawn from. All right, well, we'll let that go. We can come back, but there's a hand raised. So go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. 2 points. You mentioned, I think, N.T. Wright. So there's been a movement in biblical anthropology towards biblical holism, and often, you know, what is said is actually you have a tripartite soul, you have spirit, soul, and mind, or, you know, any number of different parts that are cognizant with different capacities, let's say. I find the holistic perspective compelling. I think that a lot of times what happens when this is addressed in biblical anthropology is that it's not very philosophically engaged. This was actually a critique of N.T. Wright by Churchhouse and Cooper, and I can't remember who else. But basically, this works biblically, right? And it makes sense, and this seems to be maybe how we experience ourselves. But how is this going to work philosophically if you need to be able to have a rigorously philosophical explanation of what this means at a substantive level? And of course, you're already defining the parameters of the debate, right? Because you're saying, oh, we need to have this type of explanation. But I mean, so is the case with any discipline. And if you want, I think part of my reason for going this direction, because at one point I did look at kind of biblical holism, and there have been a couple pieces on embodied cognition and Judaic, for example, or Hebraic interpretations of the human person. The reason I went with this is I did feel a need to be able to engage philosophically and have a philosophically viable alternative. So I'm not sure that biblical holism, I think there's something that's correct about it. I mean, there's something intuitively correct about it. But I think one of the problems you still encounter is, okay, if you have a tripartite soul and you have spirit and soul, then like, So some have argued, well, you could still kind of be a dualist, but then what do different non-physical substances look like? You know, it still seems you almost have to have this kind of separation, like sediment and then water, you know, where you just have a non-physical realm and physical realm. But the other point is that I think you're right, it does either do that, or it implies some kind of either multipartite monism, or I think you called it, or also it's called dual aspect monism or neutral monism. And that actually has been one of the things I would like to push embodied cognition away from, because in Warren Brown's work, in Fraser Watt's work, in some of the kind of select theologians who are working on embodied cognition, it's almost always the presumption I find, although often it's not explicit, that embodied cognition supports a type of monism. Fraser Watts is also not satisfied with emergentism or non-reductive physicalism, and he proposes that embodied cognition kind of proves a type of monism. I have issues with that only because I think if you have a monism, it still causes problems for immortality. And I just don't see how to get around that, which is part of the reason I've taken this route. But it's also probably my Catholic bias. So I'm an embodied person, like I have my biases.
Well, it seems like if there's no hands raised and nothing in the chat, this might be a great moment to wrap up. And it has been a really stimulating time. Thank you so much for your work, Rebekah, and for sharing your insights with us, and to some degree, some of the questions that still are out there for you, or some of the directions for further inquiry. So as I suppose, as part of the board of the Oxford Interfaith Forum, from my reading, the next, we will have, of course, future meetings. So keep up to date with what's happening, and we'd love to have you back for the next one. Rebekah, is there any final comments you want to make before we wrap up for the day?
I don't think so. Just thank you, everyone, for your great questions and for listening.
Great. Let's give her one more round of applause in some way or another. And I
thank you, Greg.
enjoyed it as much as I did. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good discussion.